Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on the final stretch, tips for obligating ARP-HCY funds before the September 30th, 2024 deadline. Thank you so much for joining us. A little bit about today's webinar as folks get signed on. This webinar will last 1 hour and 15 minutes. We ask that you please type any questions that come up throughout in the Q&A box. We will do our best to get to them all. We know you probably have a lot of questions, and so we'll do our best to get to them in this webinar. And if not, we'll share our contact information at the end for any follow-up. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded, and you will have access to both the recording and these slides through a follow-up email that will be sent to you after our session today. If you are not familiar with SchoolHouse Connection, we're so glad you're here. We are a national nonprofit advocacy organization, and our mission is overcoming homelessness from prenatal through post-secondary. We work at that mission on a number of levels through federal and state policy advocacy, a wide range of practical assistance to K-12 school districts, state education agencies, early childhood development programs, institutions of higher education, and others. And we always say the jewel in our crown is our network of young scholars who have themselves experienced homelessness and whom we are privileged to support through scholarship assistance as well as case management support along the way. We encourage you to check out our website, schoolhouseconnection.org. You can also find a lot of our Q&As from the field there. So chances are if you have a question about something in your role in your district, chances are we've answered it for someone else and you might find what you're looking for. And if not, the link to our contact form is on the website as well, where you can submit any questions that you'd like us to take a look at. Before we dive into our content for today, we want to acknowledge we have a couple different audiences probably on the call. Some of you may be coming into this conversation knowing that your state and district will for sure be applying for extended liquidation. And so you are looking for ways to make sure your funds are obligated by that September 30th deadline so that they can be included in that extended liquidation. Some of you may not know if you are able to apply for extended liquidation, and others may not be able to apply for extended liquidation. So regardless of how you're coming into this conversation, we hope that these tips will help you in this final stretch to meet that September 30th obligation deadline so that we can ensure these funds are maximized for students experiencing homelessness. I'm going to launch a poll for us here really quickly because we want to hear from you. And we'd like to know two things. The first question you should see pop up there, does your school district have unspent ARP-HCY funds? Your options are yes, no, I don't know, or maybe it's not applicable. Maybe you did not receive ARP-HCY funds. The second question we would love to know is if you do have unspent ARP-HCY funds, how much roughly remains? So your options are less than 5,000, between 5 and 10,000, between 10 and 20,000, between 20 and 50,000, or maybe you have more than 50,000 left to spend and to obligate before that September 30th deadline. So I'm going to give it just a few seconds here. It looks like folks are busy clicking their answers. Want to make sure everyone has the chance to respond. Okay. I'm seeing some last responses come in here. Great. I'm going to end this poll and display our results here. So it looks like the vast majority, 84% of you who are on this call do have unspent ARP-HCY funds. So hopefully you will get some great tips from this conversation today. And it looks like we have a really interesting split in terms of the amounts. 19% have less than 5,000. 27% of you, which is the largest percentage, have between that 5 to 10,000 range. 25% have between 10 and 20,000. 19% have between 20 and 50, and actually 11% of you have more than 50,000 of unspent ARP-HCY funds. That is really helpful for us to know as we're walking through some of our tips and strategies a little bit later in today's conversation. To get us started, would love to review just some basics about American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth Funds. And so for many of you, this may be common knowledge. This might be a refresher. Some of you, like we mentioned, might be new to this. Regardless, we want to make sure we're level setting from the start. Back in 2021, which seems like forever ago now, the American Rescue Plan was passed by Congress, and it included $800 million to address the impacts of COVID-19 on children and youth experiencing homelessness. These $800 million are known as ARP-HCY, American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth Funds. And you can see that they can be used to support identification, enrollment, and school participation of children and youth experiencing homelessness. Importantly, that includes through wraparound services. The allowable uses of ARP-HCY mirror the 16 allowable uses in the Education for Homeless Children and Youth funds, and they included some flexible, more expansive uses. Funds must be obligated by September 30th, 2024, this year, just a few short weeks. And then they have to be liquidated by January 30th, 2025. Just an important note here, because we've received this question a lot. Obligation in this instance means that funds are committed. In other words, there is a signed contract in place or a purchase has been made. And so that's what we mean when we say funds must be obligated by September 30th, 2024. It's going to be really important, as you'll hear later during our strategy section, to make sure that those contracts are signed by September 30th of this year in order to take advantage of the liquidation deadline, whether it's the January 30th or the extended liquidation. And just a note here also, some states and LEAs may have set earlier liquidation deadlines, but the obligation period remains the same. That September 30th, 2024 obligation deadline is true no matter what state you're in. And so that's why we wanted to emphasize our final stretch here today. Just this year in February, the U.S. Department of Education announced that states can apply for extended liquidation of ARP-HCY funds on behalf of themselves and their local education agencies. You'll recall that states received a set aside of ARP-HCY funds, but the vast majority went to your local education agencies and school districts. So if it's approved, state and local education agencies would have an additional 14 months to liquidate those funds through ARP-ESSER, as long as they were properly obligated. And that's the important part here. And that's why we're so emphatic about this September 30th deadline. Whether or not you can take advantage of extended liquidation, we want to make sure you are obligating every cent possible by September 30th. And if you have more questions or need to learn more about the extended liquidation process, we encourage you to check out the U.S. Department of Education's FAQ page and reach out to your state coordinator for your state-specific process. And at this point, I am going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Barbara Duffield, who's going to walk through some more recent clarifications about ARP-HCY funds.
Thank you very much, Erin. So we wanted to share some recent clarifications that have been provided in response to questions from state education coordinators, homeless education coordinators, and local liaisons. All of these answers and these questions are available on a document on our website that we'll provide in the resources section. So we're providing these now because this may help you think about the final stretch and how you commit funds before September 30th. So first is a question that's come in: may items such as prepaid debit cards, store cards, gas cards, bus tickets, laundry tokens that are purchased with ARP funds before the obligation deadline, can they continue to be used after the liquidation deadline? And the short answer is yes, they may, consistent with guidance that's previously been issued for ARP-ESSER funds. So you can, again, when you get the PowerPoint, which you will, you could click on the guidance and read the fine print. But essentially, if the state education agency is allowing it, then those can be used. The U.S. Department of Education is advising that LEAs be mindful of purchasing an amount that's reasonable and necessary based on the recent homelessness trends, and of course, to implement strong internal controls to ensure appropriate use. Because this is such a popular topic, we are offering a webinar specifically on store cards on August 20th, where we will highlight some best practices from local school district liaisons on the tracking, on the internal controls, and how this can be really useful in terms of removing barriers to enrollment and regular school attendance. On the next slide, another recent clarification that we wanted to provide: may LEAs that purchase supplies and equipment, so we're thinking by supplies and equipment, clothing, shoes, school supplies, hygiene products, devices, with ARP funds before the obligation deadline, can those continue to be used after the liquidation period? And here the answer is also yes, again, consistent with guidance that's been provided for other pandemic relief funds So essentially, if it's reasonable and necessary and the state allows it. So, and you can read a little bit more there in terms of if their supplies or equipment are no longer needed for the purposes of ARP-HCY, they can continue to be used as long as they're needed for another federal education program. So think about McKinney-Vento or think about Title I Part A. So that's another important clarification. We've gotten a lot of questions about that recently. A third clarification on the next slide to share with you, actually two on the next slide, has to do with licenses or subscriptions, and may those be used both during and after the liquidation period? And here again, the answer is yes, if the contract is signed. So think about this. Think about, for example, telehealth services or cell phone services or other thing that's more along a license or a subscription, and how that might be used past the liquidation deadline. Another clarification, may LEAs use their funds to contract with another LEA to provide services past the obligation deadline? And here again, looking at Ed's responses to state, the answer is yes, according to state or local procedures. So for example, in the case of states where there are regional LEAs, it might make sense for the regional LEA to contract with, or for the local LEAs in a region to contract with the regional LEA to provide services. Those services could include motels or staffing services. And on the next slide, a question specifically about motel rooms and short-term housing placements. This is a little bit different than questions about subscriptions or questions about supplies or store cards. So in this instance, an SEA or LEA can contract with a community-based organization or another LEA to provide short-term housing placement services during the liquidation period if there's a written commitment by September 30th, 2024. However, the SEA or LEA may not contract with the motel to prepay rooms after 9/30 because under the regulations, the federal regulations, funds for what's considered to be rental property are not obligated until the property is used. So we're starting off with a lot of technical information about recent guidance that's been provided consistent with federal regulations, but that we thought was really important to put up front because it may shape your strategies for your final ARP-HCY sprint. We've got one more clarification to provide in the next slide, which is about the use of other funds for some of these activities. One of the truly wonderful things about ARP-HCY has been how flexibly they can be spent in ways that maybe weren't understood could be used with other federal funds. So there's specific clarification now that all of the uses of ARP-HCY funds are allowable with McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Funds, except for the short-term motel stays. That's the one piece that currently does not carry over to McKinney-Vento. And you can see on the hyperlink there, the slide where the Department of Education has given that answer to state coordinators. We at Schoolhouse Connection are continuing to advocate for that as an allowable use. We had a recent win in one of the Senate appropriations bill that nods towards that. But for now, all of the allowable uses except motels do carry over with EHCY. And with respect to Title I, also, Title I funds may be used for some of the allowable activities. So for example, store cards, gas cards, limited car repairs, subject to the same two principles that guide Title I use for homeless students in the set aside generally, which is again, reasonable and necessary to assist homeless students to take advantage of educational opportunities, and as a last resort when funds or services are not available from other public or private sources. So that was a lot. Right up front around new clarifications. The hyperlink there to our clarification resources goes into more detail, and you could click on the links if you need to cite chapter and verse. But just to think about those clarifications as you're making your final plans. With that, I'll turn it back over to questions. We'll take. We want to ensure that there are questions throughout this webinar today. So we wanted to stop here because we figured there might be a couple that we could answer quickly. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A pane. It's easier for us, panel rather, it's easier for us to sort of track them there. We'll do our best to monitor both the chat and the Q&A, and know that if we don't get to your question, we'll have another period at the end of the webinar, and then we are going to follow up afterwards. We know that the next 6 weeks are so critical. So we want to make sure we can get as many questions as possible answered. And I'll turn it back over to Erin to moderate.
Perfect. Thank you. And we do have a couple questions coming in that I want to make sure we're getting out there. The first is, how do we know if we're able to apply for late liquidation? Are LEAs allowed to apply for it individually? LEAs may not apply for extended liquidation individually. That has to go through your state. And so we encourage you to reach out to your state coordinator so that they can tell you whether or not your state will be taking advantage of extended liquidation. And the process and timing looks a little different for each state, but we encourage you to reach out to learn more about that process. And then another question that came in says, can you please clarify what staffing contract could look like between LEAs or between LEAs and regional staff? And so I want to invite in our team to weigh in on that question.
I can jump in here. So I know one example that we actually have a whole webinar series on. So if you're interested in learning about this, but San Diego County Office of Education was able to set up a contract where they're able to provide short-term temporary stays. And so their LEAs work with the San Diego County Office of Education so that they go through all of the process to set up the housing for the family, and the LEA doesn't directly need to do it. So that's one example. But there may be others. And again, I'll just plug that we do actually have a webinar with the San Diego County Office of Education liaison talking about that process. And I can drop it into the chat as well.
I want to get to a couple other questions before we move on to the meat of our conversation today. Another question that came in said, so first of all, let's just clarify, liquidation is January 30th, 2025. That is what the U.S. Department of Education has set in terms of the timeline parameters, although we are aware that some states have established shorter liquidation periods. In some states, it might fall in December, others I'm hearing October. So encourage you to check with your state's liquidation deadline. But that obligation deadline is the same everywhere. The obligation is September 30th, 2024. And again, that is when funds must be entered into contract or purchase has been made. I see a question around saying, my director said this was for McKinney-Vento only. Can funds be used for families or students who are homeless short-term due to fire, etc.? I would encourage you to ensure that you are identifying those students and families who have been displaced due to fire or other natural disaster, because they do qualify and are eligible for McKinney-Vento services. And so first, to make sure you are doing that identification throughout the school year. And so then they would absolutely be eligible to receive services through these funds and programs. Another question we received, how do you purchase gas cards? Go to the gas station and purchase cards there. That's a great question we get often, so much so that we are doing another webinar about purchasing store cards and other cards, and that is coming up just next week. And in the meantime, we do have some resources on our website. That process and procedure is different in every district, and so we encourage you to work with your district's business office to make sure you're following whatever protocols they have in place. But you can find some resources on SchoolHouse's website, including sample trackers, sample contracts. That's something that a lot of district business offices like to see to ensure that no fraud or abuse is happening, but encourage you to work with your business office and check out some of our sample resources on our website. I want to pitch this question again to our team. Can gift cards from hotels.com be used after the September 30th obligation deadline?
I will jump in here. So our understanding, and there's a similar question in the chat, is that you cannot prepay for hotels, whether it's with gift cards or straight out, after September 30th. However, what you can do is you can contract with another CBO or another school district to do that placement. So it's kind of a workaround. And I'll stop and let Karen and Anasofia jump in as well.
I would just add that we do also have a webinar that talks more specifically about some of those hotel motel stays. So we will be dropping the link. It might already be in the chat for our webinar. So also a great resource to check out if you're looking for more information.
And if it seems inconsistent, it is a little confusing because motel rooms are considered rental property. So even though it's like, yes, it's a store card for a motel, there's still a distinction that's being used because of what it's being used for. So keep the questions coming, and we'll continue to try to find examples and or get clarifications on the clarifications.
And another question I'm going to pose right back to the team is, what are some examples of purchase services that the funding could be used for?
I can jump in on this one. I think purchase services can be any number of different things, but I would say anytime you're doing something with that, you want to look at those contracts. And so that could be, and hopefully I'm answering the question, but that could be anything from, a contract to provide mental health supports or services that you've got that contract in place. The contract could be for any number of other services that you need for students. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the chat and the Q&A pane. So, but just thinking about what those services are that you can have that contract in place by September 30th.
Okay. I'm going to continue to keep an eye on our chat and Q&A box. I will reiterate that some questions we may have to punt back to you in our audience because they are state or LEA specific. And so encourage you to be in touch with your state homeless education coordinator and particularly your other district partners, administrators, and business offices to get clarity on local process for some of these questions. But we really want to get to some ideas for you all, knowing that we are in the final stretch, that this September 30th obligation deadline is looming. We want to make sure you are equipped with as many ideas as possible, no matter how many, what amount of funds you have left to spend. We saw from our earlier poll, we have a wide range in this audience. That's great to see. And so we hope that everyone will have something to take away with them by the end of today's webinar. So let's get into our strategies, and Karen and Anasofia are going to carry the majority of this section, and I'm first going to turn it over to Karen to get us started.
Thanks, Erin. So we want to spend a few minutes talking about really under the allowable uses, what are ways that we can be spending our funds, as Erin mentioned. And so I'm going to start by talking about transportation. We know that transportation is a huge need across the country for urban LEAs, for rural LEAs, just everybody has transportation as a need. And so this is a way that you can choose to spend your ARP-HCY funds. And so I want to highlight here one option that's a higher cost option and one that's a lower cost. So first of all, starting with that higher cost option, I just want to highlight the Eau Claire Area School District. And you may have joined us for a webinar that we did in collaboration with the Eau Claire Area School District's liaison back in March, I believe that was. They used their ARP-HCY funds to purchase a vehicle for their students experiencing homelessness to specifically be able to do some faster routes to get students to school sooner after enrolling in school. And on top of not only purchasing the vehicle, they also used their funds to hire a driver and did some very specific professional development with that driver on McKinney-Vento. And so because they have this vehicle that's going and meeting families and this driver that's consistent and knows families, that driver is really able to act as an intermediary between the liaison and the families. So the driver can take information, school information to families, can relay information back to the liaison when there might be moves or other things happening. And that vehicle has really allowed them to alleviate some of their transportation challenges with it that they had with taxis in the community as well as their school buses. So check out that webinar if that is something that you're interested in. That is still an option for spending funds. And then I also want to highlight a lower cost option. The New Philadelphia City School District in Ohio decided to use their funds to purchase bikes. And they had a group of students in their walk zone. Their walk zone is about 2 miles. And they had a group of students that was having some challenges getting to school within that walk zone. And they were struggling to get those students to school. They were noticing that their attendance wasn't as great. And so they looked at what those options would be to help students to have an easier way to get to school. They have a lot of other students in their school community that ride their bikes to school. And so they purchased bikes and helmets for that group of students experiencing homelessness to be able to get to school in that walk zone, to have another option for transportation. And so students are able to get to school with other kids that ride bikes to school and have that as an option for transportation. So wanted to highlight those two. And then I will take us to our next slide, identification and outreach. Again, want to just highlight for you a couple of different options. One in this medium to higher cost category and the other one in the higher cost category. For those of you that still have quite a high number of ARP-HCY funds to spend, these might be some great options for you. So thinking through identification and outreach, one of the options that you have is to use the funds for stipends for school counselors, for social workers, for other school staff to come in before the start of school and to have that extra time to be re-identifying families and getting those services set up. And so I want to offer you an example of Minneapolis Public Schools that used funds to provide that extra social work time for their social workers to start coming back to school about 2 weeks early. And the purpose of that was to be reconnecting with families, re-identifying families, and having all those services in place and ready to go for the first day of school. So they had historically seen that students didn't have services set up, their transportation was not ready to go the first day of school. And so they really used that as a priority of making sure that their students experiencing homelessness were in class on day one with their peers. And so by providing those stipends, they were able to have all of that re-identification and that transportation and other services set up for the first day of school. On the higher cost side, Dayton Public Schools in Ohio use their ARP-HCY funds for radio spots, radio advertisements, as well as a billboard campaign with about 10 billboards around the city. And so they did that in order to bring awareness to McKinney-Vento in their community and to increase their identification. So just another option for those of you still thinking about ways to kind of increase your efforts and really build that community outreach. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about technology. And so want to just kind of stay in this medium to higher cost category for us for a minute and talk about cell phones and in particular kind of some of those ways of communicating with families. And so, we know that families might have experienced moves over the summer or unaccompanied youth might have experienced high mobility over the summer. They might have bounced around between a number of different places. And so providing cell phones can be a great way to get back in touch with families, have that consistent communication. Again, thinking through on a case-by-case basis, how is our families or our youth getting in touch with school? How are they connecting with the liaison when there are questions or when there are needs? So want to offer you as an example, the Kenai Peninsula School District in Alaska. They purchased cell phones and minutes for their unaccompanied youth. And they did this to help maintain contact with youth because they found when their students weren't in school, it was often hard to get a hold of them. And so with those cell phones, they're able to check in regularly and provide support. Youth are able to reach out to their connections at school when they have changes in their living situations or they need different services or supports. And so that's been a way to increase their connections with their unaccompanied youth. And then finally, I'm going to talk with you about training and professional development, and then I will turn it over to my colleague. So just to kind of think about a little bit of these maybe lower cost options when it comes to training and professional development, want to just focus on this for a minute. So thinking about kind of those extended contract hours or that stipend time to really bolster the professional development that you have in your district, to be thinking about training staff, and really thinking about who in your district or your LEA has contact with students experiencing homelessness, who's helping to provide that support, and making sure that the training materials are ready to go and are user-friendly for all of those groups. So I'll offer you a couple of examples. The East Central Educational Service Center Consortium, that's a long name, but in Indiana, their McKinney-Vento specialist in their consortium created some online training sessions that really focused on awareness, identification, and implementation of McKinney-Vento. This included building some online professional development options, things like detailed PowerPoint slides, video clips, resources that can be used by any staff member within their consortium on their own time. And so this way they have these that they can be sharing out, not just with the liaisons or the points of contact in the LEAs that are part of the consortium, but other staff members as well within those school districts. And then finally, I'll offer Concord Public Schools in New Hampshire. Their McKinney-Vento coordinator really used funds to, again, provide that stipend and those extra hours to provide support for each building's point of contact, thinking about what specific and targeted training and professional development they needed, and then looking at their processes and their procedures and being able to train school staff on those processes and procedures, developing forms for identification and providing services and tracking all of that. And so really that program implementation piece of it, they use their funds for that as well. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Anasofia.
Great, thank you, Karen. I dropped this into the chat, but I want to just reemphasize that these slides were developed based on our cost and spending guide. And so if you're looking at all of this and saying this is too much information for me to process right now, it's okay. You can look at the guide on your own time, and you can look at whatever topic you're most interested in. But in terms of supplies, this is one that is an allowable use of ARP-HCY funds. And we have seen many LEAs take advantage of this based on their need and just how much funds they have to spend. So thinking about on the lower end, thinking about providing stipends or extended contract hours to expand the capacity to actually distribute the supplies. And then on the higher end, thinking about, again, contracting with community-based organizations or other folks who may be able to support this provision of supplies. So one example that I will share is from the Greece Central City School District in New York, who actually did a webinar with us, I think last fall, talking about their process with their local laundromat. So they realized that their students really needed access to clean clothing, and the liaison specifically wanted a process that gave some humanity to the families. And so they're able to access these store cards that have vouchers. They can upload them to their app, and then they can go do laundry on their time when they need to. And in that webinar, I really encourage you to watch it, but specifically the liaison talks about just feeling that families were really grateful that they were able to do things on their own time instead of having to go to a school, provide the clothing, and kind of have that level of discretion. So definitely encourage you all to look at that one. And then in the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about emergency short-term temporary housing. So again, this is one of those unique flexibilities with ARP-HCY funds. And on the lower end, again, thinking about extending contract hours or stipends to connect families with emergency housing, or thinking about some of the higher cost things like contracting with community-based organizations or hotel booking services like Safe Stays by ReloShare. I will also just flag that many LEAs have had questions around how do we determine what families we want to access these services, what's the right time frame. And so the one thing that I will share is an example from the Tempe School District in Arizona. And so they noticed that many of their families, there's just not enough shelters, there's not enough places where they can go and spend some time in an air conditioner when there is just extreme heat. And so they decided to set aside some funding to use short-term temporary housing stays for families who perhaps are in unsheltered environments and need some refuge from those very intense summer days. So just something to keep in mind. And I will move on to our next slide, which is just around food. So again, this is another allowable use that was explicitly mentioned in the Dear Colleague letter that was published in September of 2023, and one that can be really, really helpful with supporting families and students in their regular attendance. We know that when students have full bellies, they're more likely to be able to learn in school. So again, on the lower cost, thinking about things like weekend backpacks or before or after school meals to compensate for when school meals are not available. And then on the higher end, thinking about things like stipends and contracts to expand the capacity to provide food supports to families. For this one, I will also share that the Bridgeport Public Schools in Connecticut thought that this was something that they wanted to spend their ARP-HCY funds on. And so they partnered with a local nonprofit called Filling in the Blanks to provide food during weekends and summers when there's no school meals available. So again, thinking about who's in your community and who might be able to help with that as well. And then in the next slide, I will just talk a little bit about college preparation, access, and transition. So again, this is another allowable use of ARP-HCY funds. And again, on the lower end, thinking about things like providing supplies that may help with that transition. And on the medium and higher end, thinking about things like stipends to FAFSA mentors, covering the cost of college application expenses, or doing things like working with community-based organization to support that transition to post-secondary. The Flagstaff Unified School District in Arizona actually took advantage of partnering with their Homeless Youth Connections, local nonprofit that was able to provide youth coaches to eliminate any barriers to education. So again, there's a variety of ways in which this can be adapted just to meet your needs. And we encourage you to check out our resource and determine what might work for you.
Awesome.
And with that, I will turn it over to Erin.
Thank you so much, Anasofia and Karen. I'm going to close us out here with these last two categories and examples. The second to last category we want to talk through is early childhood. And in case you didn't know or didn't remember, you can use your funds for early childhood activities to support the school readiness of children experiencing homelessness age birth to 5 or not yet school age. And want to remind you that a lot of your early childhood partners also serve parents in the prenatal stage. And so to keep that in mind as you're making referrals, want to highlight just 1 or 2 examples here. Don't forget about these lower cost options from the perspective of what a child who is not yet school age might need in order to be ready for school. Things like baby formula, diapers, potty training, pants. So making sure you're thinking about what a family with a younger child experiencing homelessness might need in order to care for that child and in order to get the school age children to school on time and regularly. And then there's some higher cost options that you might still have time to consider. One that we are really intrigued by and interested in is adding slots for children experiencing homelessness to your existing district-based preschool or other early childhood programs. One common hurdle that we hear among families experiencing homelessness is that the slots are already full. And so you might be able to work around that by adding another slot or 2 to your existing programs. Also want to put out a reminder that when you're thinking about early childhood services for younger children experiencing homelessness, making sure you're referring them to programs and that those programs do not have to be run by the district. So reaching out to your community partners, and now might be a good time to get some contracts in place by that obligation deadline with your early childhood partners. That could be your Child Care Resource and Referral, CCR&R network, your local Head Start and Early Head Start programs, your home visiting providers, your early intervention services, and others. And so want to make sure that we're considering the needs of our younger children experiencing homelessness. And then the last thing to say as we round out this strategy section and get to your really juicy questions, want to think about academic supports, of course, and thinking about things ranging from online tutoring programs, paying for the cost of those services, all the way up to contracting with those community-based organizations. That's a theme that you've heard over and over again. And then everything in between, like fees to participate in early college or dual enrollment programs, stipends for counselors who can help with transcript audits for high school students experiencing homelessness, and maybe purchasing homeless-specific modules to integrate into your early warning systems, systems like PowerSchool, Infinite Campus, et cetera, to help monitor academic progress and other supports that students experiencing homelessness might need. With that, I want to turn back to your questions, which have been pouring in. And we're so glad to see that you all came ready today. I'm going to go back just for a moment because we've noticed a number of questions coming in about staffing, which I know can be a little tricky and confusing for folks. And so want to read out a message that we shared in the chat in case you didn't see it. And hopefully this answers some of your questions. Unfortunately, staffing is not allowed through extended liquidation. However, contracts for capacity through community-based organizations or with other LEAs can be paid for during extended liquidation if your state decides to take advantage of extended liquidation. So we wanted to put that out there. We've noticed some specific questions coming in about approval for this person's salary through the state. We unfortunately are not able to speak to those specific local questions, but we can tell you what the U.S. Department of Education has said and what is allowable at the federal level through these American Rescue Plan funds. And we encourage you to double check with your administrators and others. And Barbara, I see you coming off mute.
Yeah, there's a question, a request for clarifying the timeline. So obligation September 30th. The regular liquidation period set in the federal law is January 30th, 2025. But it's important to check with your state because unfortunately some states have shortened and said, for example, mid-December is the liquidation period. So there's the obligation period, September 30th. What's in the federal law, January 2025 for regular liquidation. And then if your state applies on behalf of district and your district worked with the state for that, that's when you get the extra 14 months. And really the best, some of the best uses for that are going to be amending any contracts that you may have, some of the supplies, and store cards may be an excellent way to have a longer runway as well because they extend past the regular liquidation period. So I think maybe afterwards too, maybe we can consider doing like a timeline chart where we say we can show kind of visually to make it even clearer because it is a lot to take in.
Thank you very much. I'm going back to our Q&A box here and really encourage you to drop those questions in the Q&A box. We're doing our best to keep up with the chat as well, but we're really looking to the Q&A box to be able to answer your questions. I'm going to start here. I thought I knew where I was going to start. Again, so a question that says, what quantity or dollar amount is considered bulk needing pre-approval from PDE? Unfortunately, I don't know what PDE is, which makes me think that this is a local question and you should consult your local education agency or state office of education because they will be able to tell you what those parameters are in terms of what bulk is or what a dollar amount is that needs approval. Another clarifying question here, when funds are obligated by September 30th, this means there should be written documentation of what the funds will be used for or delivered by then. If items have to be delivered by September 30th, can you reiterate what would extension be needed for? That's a great question. I'll start and then definitely want to invite our team to weigh in. When we say obligated, again, we mean that a contract must be signed or a purchase must have been made by that September 30th deadline. Without extended liquidation, you can render those services or liquidate them through January 30th, 2025. As long as that contract is in place by September 30th. With extended liquidation, you have longer to show that you have liquidated those funds through March of 2026. So one of the reasons that that deadline is important is because if you are able to take advantage of extended liquidation, it only applies to anything that's been signed on the dotted line on September 30th. So really making sure you're getting those contracts in place, and then welcome other responses from our team as well.
Just to jump in and say, there have been some questions sort of related to this question about, for example, supplies purchased, could they be distributed later in the year? So that the answer there is yes, per the clarification. Or, cards for, the equivalent of store cards for various services like, haircuts or, grocery related items for children in a family. And that's another item that, again, you want to have purchased by September 30th in order to be able to take advantage of using it during and after the liquidation period.
Karen, I saw you come off mute as well. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I was going to say the same about supplies and just noting that if those supplies are purchased by that September 30th, that you've got time after that to deliver them. The word deliver stood out to me in that question. And so wanted to say you don't have to have, if you're purchasing school supplies for students, you don't have to have those in the hands of students by that September 30th date. And so you can estimate, using your data and using what that you've needed in the past to purchase additional supplies that you would for students that you're going to identify in the future. So having those purchased by that date is important, but not in the hands and delivered to students by that September 30th date.
That's great. I saw a question come in here asking, could we enter into an agreement prior to September 30th with our district transportation to provide services during the liquidation period? Absolutely, yes. Again, the language there for obligation is by September 30th. And so anything that you have in place by September 30th, including agreements that have been signed before September 30th, can certainly those services can be used throughout the liquidation deadline, either through January 30th, 2025, that regular liquidation, or through the extended liquidation if your district and state choose to apply for it. And similarly, can we enter into agreement with our school counselors and temporary school district staff to have extended hours with students through the liquidation period? I think that would also be a yes, again, as long as those boxes are checked in terms of having those contracts signed by September 30th, using those extended hours up through the end of the liquidation period of January 30th, 2025. And I'm looking at our chat here and our Q&A box here. I want to make sure we're getting to as many questions as possible. Certainly, I think we spoke to this a minute ago. Another idea about underwear and undergarments for students, buying these prior to September 30th for distribution as the need comes up for these students. That would certainly be an acceptable use and meet the obligation and liquidation deadlines for sure. And I'm scanning through, and our team, feel free to jump in if there's something I need to get to. Thank you for that, Barbara. I think you're seeing a lot of variation in terms of where everyone is located, your districts and states. And so we're doing our best to speak to those variations, but also want to make sure we're really communicating what the U.S. Department of Education has said. Another question says, the ideas for extra staffing in summer are great, but unfortunately no longer possible now that summer is over and the funding deadline, or the obligation deadline of September 30th is quickly approaching. Are there any possible recommendations for similar staffing options before the deadline? I think we really want to emphasize making sure you're contracting with any community-based partners who can provide those same or similar services, and making sure those contracts are in place by September 30th so that those services can continue through the liquidation deadline. If it's through a community-based contract and your state is applying for extended liquidation, then those services could certainly continue through March of 2026. So looking for other alternatives, and we've done some work at SchoolHouse to help districts assess what they have used their ARP-HCY funds for and what some of the upcoming gaps will be. And so encourage you to check out some of the resources on our ARP-HCY website as you navigate these decisions in the next couple of weeks. I'm looking through our questions here. We got a lot to get through. This next question says, I'd like to help our families with cell phone bills. Do people just get a variety of carrier refill cards, or what do people do to support different carriers like Verizon, T-Mobile, etc.? So I'll open it up to our team to share any examples that come to mind of how districts have handled this.
I can jump in with one example. There is an LEA in Oklahoma that they have developed an agreement. I'm not sure if it's a contract or if it's an agreement with T-Mobile, and they're able to get any family who does not have access to a cell phone in minutes goes through this partnership that they have with T-Mobile. It's not an advertisement for that carrier from them by any means, but it's what they were able to arrange in their LEA. And so certainly you could think about are there cell phone providers that you could partner with, or you could establish those contracts with, or those MOUs with, and think about it from kind of that partnership and contract lens.
Thanks, Karen. Another question, could we buy store cards with something like Amazon grocery, et cetera, prior to September 30th, and then keep them to use them to order food on behalf of the family's needs? The family could submit the order to us, and then we could place the order using these store cards. Certainly purchasing of store cards is allowable. And if those store cards are purchased by the obligation deadline of September 30th, you may continue to use them. Not just through the September, please check me on this team, not just through the January 2025 deadline, but U.S. Department has said those store cards may be used past the liquidation deadline. And so you want to make sure you're taking full advantage of that.
And I'll jump in. So store cards, gas cards, bus tickets, laundry tokens are one that's all sort of in the same general category. So there was a question about, there are different rules for gas cards versus store cards, given that the hotel card is a different animal. So think store cards, gas cards, bus tickets, laundry tokens as in that general category of items that can be purchased before September 30th in order to be used past the liquidation period. Hotel.com cards are the funky one.
Thank you for that. I want to keep going through our questions here. Schoolhouse Connection does offer trainings. Our back to school e-blast will be headed out to you next week, and we'll have a number of resources and McKinney Vento 101 PowerPoints in there that we hope will be helpful to you. And of course, we're always on standby if you have specific needs that fall within this deadline and our capacity. Another question says, are food cards the same as SNAP or TANF? If not, can these funds be used to purchase this documentation for students like EBT cards? When we're talking about food cards, store cards, grocery cards, again, as Barbara said, those would not be the same as SNAP or TANF. These would be like a store card to a Kroger or Walmart or Food Lion, whatever your local grocery store is. Piggly Wiggly, for those of you in the South, that's a throwback. And so those would not be the same as SNAP or TANF. I'm candidly not sure about the last part of the question. Can these funds be used to purchase this documentation for students? And so Karen, I see you coming off mute.
I can jump in on this. So there should not be documentation that's needed for cards for SNAP or TANF. You may need to help a student or a family with something like a birth certificate. I'm not sure. I don't want to speak for every state individually, so I don't know exactly what is needed to apply. But if, for example, a birth certificate was required, funds can be used to pay for that birth certificate. But there should not be any cost to apply for SNAP or TANF other than if you needed some kind of birth certificate or an ID maybe.
Thank you very much for that. Your questions are so helpful to us to be able to better understand the needs of the field. They're keeping us on our toes, as evidenced by the fact that we may have misspoke a few minutes ago. And so we want to make sure we're giving you the most accurate information. And hats off to Dr. Pat Pop in Virginia for bringing this to our attention. On the question of salaries, can salaries be paid for after the obligation period ends on September 30th? The clarification is that during the liquidation period, contractor salaries may be drawn down, but SEA and LEA staff salaries may not. And so want to be sure we're putting out that distinction to you. If you have used your ARP-HCY funds to pay for additional LEA staff salaries, then those have to be essentially paid out by the September 30th obligation deadline. However, you can continue paying those contractor salaries during the liquidation period. And contracted services may not be provided beyond the liquidation period, again, unless you are applying for extended liquidation. So thank you so much for the clarification. We apologize. I know this is a lot of information to take in, and a lot of it will be very local and specific to your context. And so we encourage you to continue submitting your questions, and we will answer as many of them as possible. But wanted to make sure we're putting out that clarification on salaries to you. Okay, I'm going to go back to our Q&A box here. Number of questions still coming in. A question says, can funds be used to purchase gift cards to a local hair salon for students to access haircuts? So I think, and again, invite our team to weigh in. I think certainly using funds to make sure students are able to continue to come to school every day is allowable, and certainly having access to haircuts and hygiene is important. Would caution you against the use of the term gift card. We want to make sure that you are not submitting a request for a gift card to a district. That is not allowed through these funds, but invite my team to weigh in on this as well, including any examples you've seen. All right. I'm going to keep us going here. Will the extended funds, will extended liquidation pay for the monthly service fee for mckinneyvento.org? I think this is a question that gets at subscriptions, and I know this is a popular one, and I'm going to turn it over to Barbara if you've got it.
Yeah, so this would be an example of a subscription service that could be extended. So the slide that we had earlier about subscriptions and licenses would fall under that one. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I want to keep going here and make sure I'm not skipping over any. Next question. We are planning to purchase items that will help support students during the holidays or long breaks like the Christmas holiday season. Those items include academic, artistic, social, emotional learning projects to support the whole child during those periods of being away from school. Is that okay? I think the short answer is yes, but invite other opinions from our team.
I'll just share, and I think someone shared this a little bit earlier, but thinking about what is reasonable and necessary for the needs of your district. So for example, if you're a district who has seen an increase of students experiencing homelessness by say 50 every year, you might want to think about what that number could look like for the school year. And of course, we encourage working with your school business office. That's usually the most seamless way to make sure that those supplies are reasonable and necessary and can be distributed in a timely fashion.
And I would just add to be thinking future tense that you want to make sure that those are purchased by September 30th, even if you don't plan to use them until the holiday time.
Thank you both very much. Another question we want to get to says, I have funding left, but my finance department is stating that it must be used for, quote, equipment, as that is how it is allocated. Our families need basic necessities like food, etc. Can this remaining funding be used as needed? So I'm going to open it up to our team on this one.
So those basic necessities are absolutely allowable. In this case, I would say it may be an issue of a budget revision that needs to be made through your state coordinator or your state grant office, depending on how that functions in your state. And so I would work with your business office staff as well as your state coordinator to make that budget revision. And I would recommend that you think about doing that as soon as possible, because those budget revisions can take time to be approved, and there is typically a process for that at the state level. And so if you can get that revision in as soon as possible, it is an allowable use. And so it should hopefully just be an issue of making that revision in the budget.
Thank you, Karen. The next question, what are the best practices for distributing supplies to McKinney-Vento students? Are we required to have students' names or districts who are receiving the items? Again, definitely want to refer you to your local district policies and procedures. I know some districts require a spreadsheet where families sign out supplies. Other districts require submission of receipts. Some districts don't. So encourage you to check with your local district business office and or your state Department of Education if they have any guidelines. But in general, want to make sure that you are getting those supplies and items to students and families who need them the most as quickly as possible. Another question we want to get to, and sorry, y'all are the questions are pouring in, and you're making my screen jump here. Excuse me. I've been told by my fiscal department that anything with money value, like gift cards, prepaid cell phone service, bus passes, etc., are considered assets and so need to be distributed, in other words, in the hands of students and families by September 30th. Does that seem right, or is this something I can push back on? I'm going to invite our team to weigh in on this one.
I would encourage you to push back on this. As long as those are purchased by September 30th, you can distribute those after that date. So again, the funds are considered obligated when those cards are purchased. So please push back on this, and also let us know if you need some support with the language to use or any additional information.
That's great. Thanks, Karen. There's another question here about obligation. Does obligation require us to have something in writing from the family that they would need one of those supplies in order for us to buy it? And the short answer is no, you don't need to have anything in writing from every single family. Some districts I know use information and data from previous school years to show the need in terms of the quantity of something that's purchased. But the key with obligation is that it has to be either entered into contract or purchased by the September 30th deadline, and then can be liquidated either through January 2025 or beyond if you're applying for extended liquidation, and invite our team to offer any additional responses.
I would just add that I would encourage you to think about what those things are that you might need. I'm joining you from Wisconsin. I can tell you that in Wisconsin, our liaisons always need winter gear. And so to be kind of forward thinking and to think through, you may not have a request for a winter coat or a pair of boots right now in this moment, but you know that every winter you get some requests for those. So to think through what those future items might be that you're going to need to purchase and that your students and families will need, and then to purchase those by September 30th. But just because you don't have that request right now, not everyone is thinking through to those colder months yet, just as an example. And so look at kind of what your needs have been previously, what requests maybe have come in from families thinking different seasons of the school year, things like that. And then you can purchase those items that you know that you'll need for your students.
Great, thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to get to as many of your questions as possible. Next question says, do I need to make sure that school supplies that I order are delivered and received by my school district by September 30th? I'm going to go out on a limb and interpret this as no, those supplies have to be purchased or under contract by September 30th, but open to other interpretations from our team. Okay, it's a good sign that I'm not hearing any counterpoints. Okay, that's a great question. But I think as long as you have a purchase order on or before September 30th, some sort of paper trail, then you should be good. Again, encourage you to work with your local business office to make sure you are set up for success in this process. Next question, could we buy store card? Oh, sorry, we already answered that one. Okay, I think we already clarified the store card, gift, fuel card, etc., vouchers. Those are all under the same category in terms of extended liquidation. I think we can get into some rapid fire questions here. So let these look a little bit shorter. Purchasing computers for students. What do we think, team?
Computers and technology
Yes.
are allowable. Sorry, Anasofia. I would also just put in the recommendation that you check with your district about how those are purchased for other students, and think through what's available for all students and if you can leverage those so that you can use your funds for other needs. But technology and computers for students to complete their academics and their programming, to apply for FAFSA, to fill out college applications, computers are absolutely allowable for all of those purposes.
Excellent. How about driving lessons for students experiencing homelessness?
Never mind. I'm going to let Karen take this one.
We unmuted at the same time. Driver's education is an allowable cost of funds. Again, we want to think about, is this reasonable and necessary? And is this the most cost-effective way for that student to have access to their school of origin transportation? And so sometimes having a student who has their own transportation might be the best way for that student to make sure that they're at school every day. And so thinking about if it's reasonable and necessary, driver's education is allowable.
Great. I saw a question that I think has been answered or disappeared about the difference between gift cards and store cards. We recommend using store cards as the terminology, or even more specific, like grocery card, fuel card, voucher, etc. And Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, just to say that the federal guidance refers to store card or prepaid debit card. So those are the terms that are consistent with federal guidance.
Great. Okay, do you find that liaisons are typically paid for their services from the funding? I think you mean from ARP-HCY funding. And I think the short answer to that is that liaisons are typically not paid through ARP-HCY funding. There are a number of funding sources available to districts outside of this one-time relief fund, including Education for Homeless Children and Youth, or EHCY funds. And we also encourage districts to reserve as much of their Title I Part A set aside for students experiencing homelessness as possible. And Barbara, I saw you come off mute. That might have been the point that you were going to make about Title I A. So, and Karen, go ahead.
I was just going to add one more thing to that. I just lost my train of thought. What was I going to add to that? Oh, I have heard from some LEAs, apologies for that. I have heard from some LEAs that they have used their ARP-HCY funds to increase the hours of that liaison and to increase the capacity of that liaison position. And so in some instances, the liaison position is funded with Title I funds, but is given extra hours and things through ARP-HCY. I just wanted to say that I would encourage you to go back and look at your data and the difference and the impact that having those extra hours has made, and to use that as an advocacy tool for increasing those hours through other funding sources like Title I.
Awesome. Thank you very much. The next question, do you have any experience with school districts buying Amazon store cards? That is something we have seen. Again, every school district process is different. Some districts purchase the cards and distribute them directly to families. We've spoken with other districts who have sat with families, and families have input their order on Amazon, and then that order was delivered to the school district, and the district distributed it to the family. So again, encourage you to work with your school business office. And we also have some resources and sample forms, contracts, and documents that you might want to check out on our website. Next question says, if we do a contract with a hotel, would this fall under extended liquidation?
Bad answer. We editorialize. So again, hotels are different because they're considered rental property. So the way to use hotels past so basically it's the placement of services that can continue during the liquidation period, but the actual buying of the motel rooms, that is considered rental property. So that can only go until September 30th.
You all are giving us such a workout today, exercising our ARP-HCY muscle. So last question I'm going to put out there, and then want to make sure I'm leaving a minute or two for our team to offer any last thoughts or clarifications. Last question says, do you have examples of gas cards or places you can purchase gas cards that can only be used for gas? We definitely have seen this. Again, it depends upon what your local options are, but you can certainly work with your local gas stations or vendors to put controls on those gift store cards or gas cards so that they can only be used for a certain item. And we see this with mass retailers as well. I think Walmart is one who will, you are able to purchase store cards that cannot be used for alcohol, tobacco, or firearms, which makes business offices happy and helps them feel a sense of relief that those are not being abused or neglected. Karen?
Just wanted to add, sorry, I have things to add on all of our questions here. Just wanted to add, when it comes to those gas cards, we have heard from places that they've had better luck going through a corporate office than going to the actual gas station themselves. And so sometimes there are corporate offices kind of in the community or nearby that you can go and get those gas cards directly. So that might be an option, just as something to offer as another way to kind of navigate that process. But one thing I did want to just mention about store cards and gas cards in general, we've talked a lot about the different processes and procedures to get those to families and to distribute those and to be purchasing those. And I really just want to encourage you and recommend that you really think about what those processes look like to make sure that we're not creating barriers and putting up more barriers for our families to access the things that they need. So when you're working with your business office, when you're kind of developing those processes or what that tracking might look like, just want to remind everyone that we want to have our students to have access to all that they need to be successful in school, and we don't want to create additional barriers through our own kind of internal processes.
That is a great note to end on. I'm going to share just that we have some additional resources linked in these slides, which we put in the chat earlier. You'll also receive a copy in a follow-up email. What I really want to get to is our contact information. I have a feeling that there are a lot more questions under the surface, or that maybe some of our answers have sparked more questions. And so we want to make sure you have access to us. Please reach out to any and or all of us with additional questions that you have about making sure that every cent possible of these funds can be obligated by September 30th of this year. And again, that is so that we can maximize the impact for our students experiencing homelessness in your districts and states. We thank you so much for joining us today and for all the work that you're doing on the ground. Again, you'll receive a copy of the recording, a copy of today's slides via email. I also encourage you, you're going to get a pop-up feedback survey. We actually pore over your responses when we receive these through Zoom. We look through these spreadsheets and these responses to help us inform what else we can offer to the field that would be most practical and most helpful to you. And so we really appreciate you sticking around for another 30 seconds and sharing your input with us so that we can help you help our students. So again, thank you so much for being here today. Please reach out to us with any additional questions or any success stories you've had. We are in this final stretch. We want to enter celebration mode. This is a historic amount of funding that has been distributed to students experiencing homelessness, and we believe that you have been doing historic things with it. And so we want to be able to know and to highlight what those things are. And again, we take that into our ongoing advocacy. Barbara and our colleague TJ are on the Hill almost every day, making sure that lawmakers are not jeopardizing and actually expanding this funding for all the work that you do. So thank you again. We look forward to hearing from you, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.